Hey guys, so today what we're going to be doing is looking at some of the problems and solutions that we faced in America just after World War II and kind of how this is going to lead us into the rest of the 20th century, kind of how America was responding to the Cold War at home and this sort of thing. So you should have a chart that's 2 pages, says domestic problems after World War II on the top. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. So the first problem that we have is this fear of spies and communists. This is really kind of the second big Red Scare. So it makes sense when you think about it, right? So we've talked a lot about how we're starting the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and we have a lot of issues with what's going on there. And so this new kind of wave of fear of communist regime and communist philosophy really comes up. Particularly, we're afraid of like government workers and defense officials having access to communism. Remember, these are the guys who are working with like the top government secrets, with the hydrogen bomb, and we don't really want to see like them passing secrets on to the Soviets. We're also worried that there is a wave of communism in the entertainment industry. If you think about Hollywood, oftentimes in Hollywood, you know, a lot of actors and producers have a lot of thoughts on politics, and you know, it's really easy to convert the public, and so there's kind of this fear that they're going to use movies and television as a way to like sway people to communist ideas, and this really leads to a second major Red Scare. So there are a couple things that we come up with, some good, some kind of a little iffy, about how we're going to handle this. So the first thing that we do is we establish what's called the Loyalty Review Board. Basically, all government employees have to sign a document that swears that they are not and never have been a member of the Communist Party. And this is kind of a way to like say, you know, you have to swear this if you want a job with the government, and if you're not willing to do this, then maybe you're a communist, right? And so in some ways you can kind of imagine it as saying like, we are making you swear that I am not, never have been a Republican or a Democrat, right? It's kind of a political party, but there's this fear that if you're a communist, then you probably sympathize more with the Soviet Union, right? And you might pass spies on information. The other thing that we said that we do is establish the HUAC, which is the House of Un-American Activities Committee. Okay, so let me say that again. House of Un-American Activities Committee. So this was a board that was set up to kind of root out communism throughout the country. Particularly, they were investigating Hollywood. Remember, I said that a lot of people worried that it was part of the entertainment industry, and so they were kind of investigating writers and producers and that sort of thing. There are 10 these writers and directors who are known as the Hollywood 10. They refuse to come before the board. They're saying like, it doesn't matter whether I'm a communist or not. That's really none of your business. They refuse to swear, and they are put in prison for refusing to come before the board and testify. And this causes a lot of big controversy in the country. And, you know, there are people who are protesting this, and there are also people who support this. And it becomes a really big issue. Particularly because people were encouraged on, well, maybe you're not a communist, but you know someone who is, so maybe you turn somebody in, right? And so there's kind of this layer of suspicion, and really nobody was safe. Walt Disney was brought before this board, a lot of the major playwrights of the day, actors, all kinds of people. Nobody was really safe from it. Next, kind of some examples here. We have a man named Alger Hiss. So Alger Hiss works for the State Department, and he is accused of being a spy. He does deny it. However, there is an investigation that is led by Richard Nixon, and so that's kind of important to know that he leads this investigation. He is eventually convicted of perjury, which is lying under oath, and jailed. They couldn't find any hard evidence that he had been a spy. However, in the late 80s and 90s, some evidence surfaced that maybe said that he actually might have been passing secrets along to the Soviets. Another couple who are accused of spying are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They are basically they are accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. Part of the problem with these guys is that because they are both Jewish, they received a lot of major persecution for that. They go to court. Again, the only evidence against them is testimony from one man who was a convicted spy. There's no hard evidence against them, but they are both convicted and sentenced to death and are both executed by the electric chair. Again, evidence in the 80s and 90s came out that said Julius Rosenberg probably was guilty. However, Ethel Rosenberg was most likely innocent or maybe played a very small role. And so a lot of people thought this was a really harsh punishment. All of this together is part of what we call McCarthyism. So Senator Joseph McCarthy was kind of the leader of this whole movement, where he kind of was encouraging this Red Scare. He would bring these charges up that had very little or no evidence, maybe just, again, the evidence of somebody who is willing to testify. And a lot of people compared this to a witch hunt, okay? So I've got my witch's hat here. So this is kind of this idea that Senator Joseph McCarthy is encouraging this fear of communism, right? Of this kind of big unknown force, which may or may not even be true, but people are so terrified that they want to believe it, right? And people are so worried that they might be accused that they start accusing other people. And this is very similar to what was going on in like the Salem witch trials. So much so that one man decided that this was so similar that he wrote the play, The Crucible. This is Arthur Miller, who was a very famous playwright at the time. He was actually accused of being a communist, and he wrote the play The Crucible, which is about the Salem witch trials, but it's an analogy for this whole movement, okay? So Senator Joseph McCarthyism, this whole fear of communism, became known as like the witch hunts of the period, okay? Over 200 government employees, military officials are accused of being communist. A lot of the trials are actually televised, so people are watching this from home. Almost none of this is proven from any of this, and it just kind of went on to kind of fuel the hysteria that was going on in the United States at the time. Next major problem that we have are returning veterans from World War II. So after World War I, there were not a lot of things set up for veterans who were coming home. They just kind of came home and we were like, thanks for your service, go have fun, right? Well, a lot of these guys that are coming home, they, were young, they graduated high school but didn't get to go to college before they joined up. They need a place to live, they need a job, right? Remember, during the war, a lot of jobs are taken over by women or African Americans, and industry starts to back down in the mid-40s, as we're not in war anymore, so we didn't really need as much work. So a lot of returning veterans come home to face a lot of issues. So the problem that we come up with is something known as the GI Bill, or the GI Bill of Rights is the other word. Basically what it would do is provide low-cost loans to veterans in order to get them, sorry, a little pixie down here is causing a problem, low-cost loans for college, housing, in order to start their own businesses, get their families back on track. And so this was just a way to kind of support veterans as they were coming back from the war in a way that had not really happened before. So again, that's also known as the GI Bill of Rights. You might want to just jot that down. They also were given full year paid unemployment to kind of get them back on their feet if they couldn't find a job right away. So again, a way to give veterans support as they're coming home from war. All right, next problem we have. So we've got all these veterans who've come home from war, right? We've got all these people all over the country, and there is a housing shortage. People need a cheap and easy place to live. And so what comes up is the suburbs, right? So the 1950s is kind of the era of the suburbs. And what we're going to kind of see is that people want to live in the suburbs, but they also need a house that's cheap, right? So William Levitt comes up with this kind of solution and founds his own little city in New York, Levittown, named after himself, and basically he comes up with these like cookie cutter houses almost, where you can basically build one of these houses really, really quickly. The houses are very standard. The neighborhoods just kind of pop up from all over the place. They're relatively cheap, so these returning veterans and their families can afford them. And this is kind of the beginning of like these standard neighborhoods. If you've ever, driven through a neighborhood, you see like all the houses look very similar. They all have the same kind of floor plan. This is the beginning of that kind of era. And this was great. There were, some major pros and cons here. People could get cheap housing. But a lot of times these, suburbs were really only for the white communities, right? So they were segregated. So that is another issue that we are going to see. Next problem comes with labor unions, right? So there are some strikes all over the country, particularly in the steel, coal, and railroad industry. So this is going to cause shortages in these industries, and these are pretty important industries in the country. It's also going to cause prices to go up. So President Eisenhower basically steps in. He's like, all right, guys, here's the deal. Like, if you don't get your crap together, I'm going to draft you guys into the military, right? So if you can't, work in labor, then maybe I'm going to put you into the military. Remember, Eisenhower was a general, right? So that's just kind of a solution that he comes up with, right? So he passes an act called the Taft-Hartley Act, which basically says that the president has the authority to call off a strike for 80 days if it's threatening the industry of the country. So this gives the president a lot more control over strikes and kind of what labor unions are allowed to strike and this sort of thing. He also does, part of this act, however, is that both sides have to participate in federal mediation in order to end the strike. So basically the government's going to come in and try and work with both sides, both management and the unions, in order to try and solve the problems. And this is, again, a way to kind of make sure that production doesn't slow down, that everything kind of gets back on track quickly, and it doesn't cause a problem in the country. All right. So the last major thing that we're going to talk about here is civil rights. And so here's the kind of problem, okay? African Americans gone off and fight during World War II, right? Huge numbers of African Americans are in the Army and the Navy. They are in segregated units during the war, which, a lot of people say is a major problem. But they do these amazing, heroic things, and they're fighting for freedom of people in Europe, right? So a lot of people say, well, wait a minute. I fought for freedom in Europe, but then I come home and I can't sit at a lunch counter, right? So there was a major issue, especially in the South, where there's segregation in schools, in public facilities. A lot of African Americans are still unable to vote because of poll taxes and literacy tests. Lynching is still taking place. There's discrimination in hiring, like people being able to get jobs, in housing, as I said a minute ago. So civil rights is still a major, major problem throughout the country. President Truman initially steps in, and he really wants to help. He thinks that there's a lot of hypocrisy in the country. So the first thing that he does is try to reform. However, Congress prevents a lot of these. Congress is controlled by the Southern Democrats who are against desegregation, even though Truman himself is a Democrat, right? So there's a split in the Democratic Party here, where Northern Democrats are for desegregation and Southern Democrats are against it, right? President Truman does sign an executive order that desegregates the armed forces. It's kind of a way that he could go around Congress a little bit. So this is a really big deal. So now we can have black and white units together in the armed forces. However, when he does this, that split becomes really firm in the Democratic Party. And so Democrats who do not like Truman's pro-civil rights policies left the Democratic Party and form what's called the Dixiecrat Party, okay? So think about that word Dixiecrat, right? So they're essentially Democrats, but think about the word Dixie. Where does that imply? The South, right? So they're Southern Democrats is basically what this is. And the main difference that they have with the regular Democratic Party is that they are pro-segregation. In 1948, they do actually make a run for president. Strom Thurmond, who's this guy that I'm pictured right here, runs for president of the Dixiecrat Party. He obviously is not elected. He is from South Carolina, and he's still a really big name in South Carolina. My brother went to the University of South Carolina, and the gym there is the Strom Thurmond facility. So that's just kind of one of those interesting things. It also came out in the early 2000s that Strom Thurmond actually fathered a black child with a servant who lived in his house. So there was some controversy surrounding the whole Strom Thurmond thing. It is also at this time that a guy named Jackie Robinson becomes a really big name. So Jackie Robinson integrates professional baseball. This is a big deal. Baseball is like the #1 sport in America at the time period. And African Americans were not allowed to play professional sports, or they had their own divisions, but they were separate divisions that weren't as well funded. But Jackie Robinson gets drafted onto the Dodgers, which is a huge deal. There's a big, a lot of people see it, especially for African Americans, see it as a really big symbol that things are starting to change for them. A lot of white people in the country were really upset by it. But this integration of professional baseball is a really big step for African Americans. And again, it's a very symbolic gesture for African Americans as well. The next thing that we have here is Brown versus the Board of Education. So Brown v. Board was led by an NAACP lawyer named Thurgood Marshall, who's pictured right here. And this is basically a series of test cases where they were trying to test the law that the Supreme Court said that separate is equal. Like you can have separate facilities as long as they're equal. Specifically what they're trying to look at here is high school. Right, or schools in particular. Strom Thurmond will actually go on to become the first African American on the Supreme Court. So that just kind of gives you an idea of who he is, or Thurgood Marshall rather. And so this is all about desegregation of public schools, right? So there's basically a little girl whose last name is Brown, hence the name, who lives really close to a white school but has to go all the way across town to a black school. The NAACP approaches her family and says, hey, is it okay if we use your family as a way to try and test these laws and prove that this separate but equal is not a good thing? They agree. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The justice on the Supreme Court is a guy named Warren at the time, Earl Warren, and he rules in favor of Brown versus the Board, saying that separate is inherently unequal. You cannot be equal if you are in separate facilities. And if you looked at the facilities, they were not equal. Like they were in sometimes even one-room schoolhouses. The teachers may have very little training. Textbooks were the hand-me-down textbooks. I mean, there's a lot of major issues that was going on in education. So this is a really big step for African Americans and for civil rights. It's going to be the first rule for desegregation. First law for desegregation in the country. It takes a while for a lot of schools to integrate, however. They don't do it immediately. There's a line in the court case where they said, with all due speed, and a lot of one, basically saying, you can do it as quickly as possible, and a lot of them took that to mean as quickly as possible means I can take my time, right? So this is going to become a bigger issue as a lot of African Americans are starting to say, I want to go to these better schools, right? This is nowhere more true than in Little Rock, Arkansas. So there are 9 black students in Little Rock who are chosen to desegregate Central High School, which is the local high school in Little Rock. And what they decide to do is say that we need to force this segregation issue so they can go to the school. The governor of Arkansas, Governor Falbus, who is a super racist guy, tries to block it. He actually tries to use the National Guard to block this desegregation issue. The president at the time is Eisenhower, and Eisenhower says, you can't do that. He nationalizes the National Guard and uses them to protect the Little Rock Nine. And so they are basically escorted with armed guards into the school, and they successfully desegregate the high school. These are just some pictures here of the Little Rock Nine. So these are the students up top who are chosen to go to the high school. This is a picture here of them walking to the school. And just look at this picture here. This girl is walking in surrounded by hatred. People are yelling at her, saying terrible things. Look at the faces of the people behind her. and she's just very calmly walking in, and she's making a point, right? She's making a point that says, this is worth it for me. So that's kind of where we are with this. This is a picture that was taken in the 2000s. I can't remember exactly what year. All of the Little Rock Nine who are still alive kind of got together here. And this is a picture of Governor Falbus. He's a happy-looking guy, right? Very upset about the whole integration thing. So this kind of wraps up some of the domestic issues that we are looking at. We'll go a little bit more in depth into them in class, but this kind of gives you a good foundation for what's kind of going on in the United States. So I will see you guys soon. Bye-bye.